Statistical Economy and Law Seminar Series. Today we are having a seminar with Professor Khalid Jordan. Khalid Jordan was an associate professor at the Faculty of Law at McGill University and a member of the Institute of Comparative and Private Law. Since 2007, she has been a full-time faculty member at Melbourne Law School in Australia, and prior to that time, an associate professor at the University of Florida. Khalid Jordan is a frequent speaker on corporate governance, capital markets, and corporate law. Today she will talk about international financial standards and the explanatory force of tax material. Welcome to the IC, Khalid. Welcome.
Thanks very much, everybody, especially for coming out on such a snowy evening. But I think Lydia forgot to mention one of the most important things that I've done is that I was part of the inaugural faculty at IUC here. And so this was my classroom in the winter of 2008, 2009. So I really felt that I didn't need much of an introduction. Some of the faces have changed. There are a few that are the same, like I told you. So I feel quite comfortable being back in this classroom. I'm delighted to be here back to Karina. Now let me tell you a little bit about the talk. I was told that I should talk for about 50 minutes and then we can have discussion. And the talk really has 4 different parts to it that represent four different strands of my thinking, experiences, career, as they work themselves together. I teach international capital markets, which I've been teaching since 1991. It's changed a whole lot since then. But I also teach comparative law, which is really which I dearly love, and I don't get to teach enough. But sometimes I get to teach both of those courses in the same program or even at the same time, and there are all sorts of interesting ideas that spin off from teaching 2 very different disparate courses. I've also been in private practice. I spent nearly 10 years in international commercial practice, actually practicing international commercial law. And I also spent time at the World Bank, working with international financial standards in terms of implementation and use of international financial standards. And so all of these 4 strands of my experience, if you like, come together in this paper. Now, one of the things that always strikes me when I teach comparative law is how persistent are the patterns of legal thought, how they persist over generations and generations, and continue to work and operate and form how people think about law. And so this is my little quote from the beginning: the past is never dead, it's not even past. That we have much of the past, especially in the way people think about law, that keeps working in the present in ways that people sometimes forget or fail to recognize. And this is part of what my talk is about. Now, I spent 2010 in the United States at one of the big U.S. law schools on sabbatical, and so I was listening to my colleagues talk about international financial standards. And this was in the wake or in the continuance of the global financial crisis, and there was a discourse, debate that was going on about international financial standards and their nature, and the soft law nature of the various international financial standards that have come to prominence during the course of the global financial crisis. And there are several papers. I listened to several people talking about the international financial standards and soft law and what were these international financial standards, how could they work, what was their normative force, what would they make a difference. There was, this is a quote from Chris Brummer at Georgetown Law School. He has a paper titled Coercive Soft Law, something that is kind of forceful, although it does not have the stature of statute or is not actually enforceable. And people were pointing to these gradations of normativity in terms of the kinds of instruments or instruments which could be evoked to deal with the global financial crisis. And so hard law, regulation, state law, having disappointed, having failed, there having been regulatory failure during the global financial crisis, could soft law, these international financial standards, could they fill the gap, could they operate better? Now, I have always had I had a real sense of an unease with this discourse about soft law and international financial standards for a couple of reasons. One is, I think that the concept of international financial standards and soft law is understood differently in different legal systems and by people with different legal experience in different legal systems. And that it also reveals what I call very different patterns of legal thought that cut across national boundaries. And so when people start talking about soft law and international financial standards, they may be talking at cross purposes if they're coming from different legal systems, because they have different understandings of what it means. I've also worked with international financial standards firsthand on the ground in the country, working with international financial standards in my work at the World Bank. And the last 10 years of experience with international financial standards has been decidedly mixed. And lastly, and this is where actually having been a commercial lawyer in international practice, it occurred to me that international commercial practitioners are operating across boundaries all the time in huge transactions, major transactions, and that no one talks about soft law. This discourse of soft law, and the normative force of international financial standards, and where does normative force come from in international transactions? It's not there. It's simply not there. And so practitioners do not think in this way. And I started to wonder what that meant, because they are obviously engaged in legal transactions which are occurring across borders. Okay, so what are the normative forces at work in international finance? Well, in thinking about this disconnect between theory, soft law, and international financial standards, and then practice, I thought that maybe there are some clues to what the normative forces are that are at work in international finance. And what I started to see, and this comes partly from having spent January to June last year in London, I started to see in the world of international finance outlines of very old transnational law, which is sometimes referred to as the Lex Mercatoria, which in itself is quite contentious. It's quite a contentious concept. There's a recent paper in the United States by a young scholar called The Myth of the Lex Mercatoria, really contesting whether anything such as this has ever existed. But this is the last piece of the paper, and it's the one that I'm still thinking about. And it's the one that has evoked the most comment among some of my colleagues who think that I'm really getting a little bit far out on the branch with what I'm saying here. But this is what I started to see in international finance. I teach international capital markets, and I started to see the outlines of what I think is a kind of very old Lex Mercatoria, and I'll tell you a little bit more about that at the end of the paper. So, this is the first point on these differing conceptions or understandings of what soft law and international financial standards are. Now, what I heard in the United States among colleagues who were writing and speaking on international financial standards and the nature of these standards as soft law, what I saw was very much a fixation on law as it emanates from the state and as it is judicially enforceable. So that to be considered law, you had to have state authority behind the iteration, and it had to be judicially enforceable. This seemed to be very much ingrained in the thinking. And so that international financial standards which are created. There are all sorts of different kinds of international financial standards, but they are not. They are set by standard setters, which are not nation states, and they are not judicially enforceable. And so this was a problem for some of the U.S. academics and writers in terms of looking at these international financial standards. That what do you do? What is their normative force, and what are they? And how can they have any effect if they don't emanate from the state, and if they are not judicially enforceable? And I think that there's really quite a distinction between the way the U.S. scholars, the U.S. practitioners look at international financial standards and those in the United Kingdom. Because the United Kingdom, we know, it's a country of the common law, and the UK is much more comfortable with more diffuse sources of law, and I'll talk a little bit more about that. And often you hear Anglo-American common law, but I think there are very, very strong differences in the nature of law in the United States, the common law in the United States, the variety that you have in the United States, and what you find in the United Kingdom. Continental juris, and this is a gross generalization. I make this to be somewhat provocative. With continental jurists, you find that continental jurists are often relatively unconcerned by judicial enforcement. But in the United States, the focus was very much on law as emanating from the state and being judicially enforceable. Now, the U.S. soft law discourse. This is where I think the U.S. academics are having trouble with international financial standards, and we're focusing on their soft law nature. The idea of concepts of normativity floating free of the state and judiciary were very problematic for them. I've practiced law in the United States, but I come from a Commonwealth jurisdiction with an English law tradition. And I know that when I first went to practice law in the United States as a young lawyer, what struck me was how different the approach to what law was. So that formal written law, codes, statute, regulation were very important in the United States, and much more important than in the Commonwealth jurisdictions that I was familiar with. So that formal written law, regulation, codes, statutes, very, very important in the United States. Also, the judiciary, of course, very powerful judiciary. So judicial enforcement. Very much these two concepts of formal written law on the one hand and judicial enforcement. In order to have normative force, you had to have formal written law and judicial enforcement. I think is imprinted on the U.S. legal psyche in a way that it's not in the United Kingdom. One of my former colleagues at McGill Law School looked at the United States and said that the particular genius of the U.S. legal system, and this is a quote from his book, was the constructive combination of elements of both civil and common law. And what he was referring to was the importance of formal written law on the one hand as coming from a civil law tradition, particularly the French tradition in the United States, and the judicial enforcement, the judiciary, the importance of the judiciary coming from the English common law tradition. The UK, as I said earlier, the UK, I think, is much more comfortable with more diffuse sources of law. It is a land of customary law. It is a land of the judiciary. Statutory law, formal written statutory law, is, I think, second best. It's quite remarkable how differently the UK views statutory law. And it is seen as a fix. You use statutory law when the common law has failed, when the common law has become too complex, isn't functioning properly, has become too obscure, or there's a little problem that you've got to fix and you can't wait for the common law to evolve in a manner to fix it. So that there is the resistance to formal written law, to statutory law. And I think that you see this difference between the United Kingdom and the United States playing out in what I call the transatlantic debate on financial regulation. You have, on the one hand, you have in the UK, you've had an approach called principles-based regulation, whereas in the United States, you have had rules-based regulation. And you've had a debate between the United Kingdom and the United States with respect to what is the best way to actually address various financial issues. Is it by using these very general principles-based codes in the sense of voluntary codes, or very technical, formal, written statutory rules-based regulation? Voluntary codes of commercial behavior are very popular in the United Kingdom, but very difficult in terms of implementation in the United States. And you have another regulatory technique which comes out of the United Kingdom called comply or disclose. But these various aspects of differences of opinion on how you regulate on the financial markets is, I think, part of this difference between the United Kingdom and the United States in terms of their patterns of legal thought. Continental codal jurisdictions, there's a different, more subsidiary role for the judiciary, and you also have the primacy of written law. So you have this triumvirate of the written word, which is authoritative: doctrine, code, statute. And I'm giving you this, these are obviously generalizations. They're very gross generalizations in some ways, but I think I will try to tie these together in terms of how they play out with respect to international financial standards. Because I think that in the UK and in continental Europe, I think both the UK and continental Europe are more open to concepts of transnational normativity in a way that the United States is not. Because the United States is focusing on law emanating from state authorities, and which is judicially enforceable. And in the UK, I think that international financial standards are more accepted as a force, and a very legitimate force, in terms of being an extension internationally of principles-based voluntary codes that you find in financial markets in the United Kingdom. And I put a caveat here, if rooted in commercial reality. And the caveat of if rooted in commercial reality, I put that there because there is a very much a pragmatism in the UK in terms of the acceptance and operation of these voluntary principles and codes of commercial behavior that you find in the UK. And I was thinking of the distinctions that I've been making here, I thought that perhaps in continental Europe, that the acceptance of international financial standards as having an inherent normativity might come from the fact that they are written, and that the fact that they are written may be giving them an inherent authority irrespective of their provenance. And then who cares about the judicial enforcement? And this observation came to me quite anecdotally when I was having a lunch with a German jurist, Klaus Haupt, and I was asking him about codes of corporate governance, I was on the corporate governance beat for many years, and all over the world. And I was asking him how voluntary codes of corporate governance, which originated in the United Kingdom, voluntary codes of corporate governance, I was asking him how they had been, how they were working out in continental Europe. Because I had predicted rather rashly that the concept of voluntary code in continental Europe was an oxymoron, that it would not be understood. And I'd seen this in Russia, for example. I'd seen this in some other countries, with these voluntary codes of corporate governance being transplanted into continental European countries, and that they were simply not understood. The idea of voluntary code, it was a contradiction in terms. So I had not thought that they would be effective. However, what I was told, somewhat to my surprise, was that they were turning out to be fairly effective, that people were complying with them. And anecdotally, at least, I've been told that there seemed to be an even higher rate of compliance with these voluntary codes in continental Europe than there was in London, where they originated. And I was trying to explain this to myself, and I thought perhaps it was because they were called codes. Even though they didn't emanate from a state authority, you didn't have Napoleon standing behind them, but because they were called codes, and because they were written, that those facts gave them an inherent authority and normative force. Okay, so this is all. I'm trying to be a little provocative here. Now, let's look at international financial standards themselves. As I say, I think that in different legal systems, they are viewed differently, and that their nature, even as soft law, is understood differently. So people may be talking from different places, may be talking at cross purposes. But there has certainly been this huge surge of interest in international financial standards since the global financial crisis, and the calls for concerted international action and more international financial standards. I did a paper with an Italian colleague, a financial economist, about 10 years ago, and we at that time counted 43 different sets of international financial standards. This is 10 years ago, 43 different sets. So international financial standards, there are lots of them, and they've been around for a long time. And there are all sorts of different kinds of international financial standards. I'm going to talk about one particular set in this paper, just one particular set, but they're all very different. But they have, since the international financial crisis, and also since the Asian financial crisis of 11 or 12 years ago, they have been looked to as prophylactic and diagnostic tools. So they were looked at as being a way of preventing crisis and contagion if countries conform to the international standard, national nation states, and also they were used by the IMF and are still being used by the IMF and the World Bank as diagnostic tools going into countries in these exercises that I've participated in called financial sector assessment programs, where a country where economists and occasionally the odd lawyer gets to go wrong, and teams go into countries and look at the financial system in a blitz kind of way, using sets of international financial standards to benchmark and rate the countries. Now, academically, there has been a focus on the soft law nature of these standards. And personally, I think this has been at the expense of a real critique of the substance of these standards and the decidedly mixed experience in the last decade. Now, the Financial Stability Forum was created in 1999 in the aftermath of the Asian financial crisis. And this was at the instigation of what was then called the G7. And it was comprised of national finance ministries, central banks, and international financial institutions. It was a direct response to the Asian financial crisis. And this is what the financial term which the Asian financial crisis brought to us was contagion. This is really the first time people started to talk about contagion, financial contagion. In Asia, in the Asian financial crisis, it was contained to a region, and not even all countries in the region were touched by the contagion. But it was such a significant event that the Financial Stability Forum was created to promote financial stability, cross-border financial stability, and to serve as an early warning system to detect vulnerabilities in financial systems, national financial systems, and to promote the development of international financial standards. This was one of its stated goals. Now, the implementation of these financial standards was through these financial sector assessments, where these teams of economists and financial economists, and as I say, the odd lawyer would be brought into countries to look at the financial system and assess the financial system, all the different aspects of a financial system against international financial standards. Now, the Financial Stability Forum. Let's see. I'll get to that. Okay. The Financial Stability Forum did not avert the global financial crisis. So the implementation of and the financial sector assessments did not either prevent or detect the global financial crisis. So to this extent, the Financial Stability Forum, I think, was a patent failure. It did not see the global financial crisis coming, and there are some very interesting reasons for that. And we now have a successor body, which is called the Financial Stability Board. The board is supposed to give it more formality and more gravitas. Why did the Financial Stability Forum and the use of international financial standards, the soft law standards, why did it fail so miserably? There's some reasons behind this. I think I'll just sort of skip through this a little bit more quickly. It has been delegated, if you like, or to the dustbin of history at this point. But some of the international financial standards that were developed in the context of or at the instigation of the Financial Stability Forum, there was this very vagueness to them, lacking in detail. They didn't really have the granularity that you find in international commercial practice. One of the virtues was said to be that they were easy to change. Financial stance, soft law, you could change it very easily. But in practice, it did not work that way at all, that they had very arthritic symptoms that these international financial standards, once set, were not easy to change at all. The FSAP experience, where these teams went out from the IMF and the World Bank carrying with them the international financial standards to benchmark countries, 12 standards were used. Sometimes not all of them were used in the same exercise, but 12 international financial standards were identified by the Financial Stability Forum. They were not all necessarily used in any one country. A couple of the most popular would be the IOSCO principles of securities regulation, the OECD principles of corporate governance. Those are two of the sets of standards that I was more familiar with and I was being asked to use and assess when I went out with the teams. They generated a gold mine of data. There were over 100 countries participated. However, the data, and this is in the period 1999 to 2009, the data that was generated created this data nightmare. That there was just overlap, duplication, inconsistencies in the standards. Not all the standards were of the same caliber. The methodology was in a constant state of flux. There was a great variability of the teams of people going out, and there were Kevin de Chapelle. There was a tremendous infighting and rivalry between the IMF and the World Bank on the teams themselves. The IMF and the World Bank both assess their own programs on a regular basis. Every 5 years or 3 to 5 years, they have a formal internal review of programs, which are very candid and it can be quite critical. And this, both the IMF and the World Bank engaged in these critiques of this whole financial sector assessment program using international financial standards. And it is an ongoing critique every 3 to 5 years. Now, some of the observations that were made through the financial sector assessments using the international financial standards were spot on. These are two that were absolutely dead right. And one was that Iceland was identified as being vulnerable in 2002, but that did not prevent the failure, the near failure of the Icelandic economy in the global financial crisis. The importance of supervision and risk assessment of large, complex financial institutions was also one of the factors that was identified in the financial sector assessments. But these very acute observations were, if you like, lost in the noise because there was so much data. These comments are taken from the IMF itself. These are the critiques made by the IMF of this process of financial sector assessments. The parachuting of teams into countries, a team of 20 people would be dropped into Tunisia. I was just thinking about this the other day, thinking, Tunisia, sunshine, yes, but dropped into Tunisia for 2 weeks and out they go, parachuting without time to really absorb what's going on, a failure to take into account the local circumstances. The data was not being scrutinized rigorously enough. There was a ratings and check the box mentality against these standards, literally matrices and little checks would go into the matrices and countries would be given ratings. And then a standardization of advice, regardless of the country or the problem. The same advice would be given over and over and over again. And this is very embarrassing. This is very embarrassing. Sometimes even the name of the country wasn't changed. That was very embarrassing. So overly simplistic messages. This is all the self-critique of the IMF. Overly simplistic messages were being given. There was gaming of the system. Countries. China is one of the countries that was mentioned in a book called Law and Capitalism. By 2 Columbia Law School professors. China would implement legislation so that the box would get checked without any, so that the box would get checked and that China would be in compliance with international financial standards and would get a higher rating than the United States. This was a documented comment by a Chinese official giving a seminar at Columbia Law School. The program was voluntary, so China, Indonesia, and the United States did not participate. So 20 to 25% of systemically important countries didn't participate in the EXAP process. So these were the problems. These were the problems with the use of international financial standards. The EXAPs identified domestic and not cross-border risks. They were done on a country-by-country basis. This is one of the comments from the IMF that there should be greater efforts to distill common cross-country messages from the various exercises. Labor-intensive, intrusive, some countries felt they got burned by the whole process. Legal origins literature, which is problematic, was influencing some of the exercises. And this is my own critique is that, and I'll get to this in a minute, is that the international standards were being called international standards somehow, but in some cases they were not international at all. They represented reheated domestic law with all of the assumptions and deficiencies of the country of origin. And that would lead, in many cases, to the enactment of suboptimal regulation and misinterpretation in the countries which were complying with international standards by actually regulating. So, this is the example I'm going to show how this happens. These are the IOSCO objectives and principles of securities regulation. A set of international financial standards on securities regulation that were created in 1998 by IOSCO, which is the International Organization of Securities Commission, which has had a very interesting history. It really started as a talk shop for regulators, in primarily North America, and then North America and London, and then North America, London, and Europe. And now, I think there are over 100 countries around the world who send regulators to the International Organization of Securities Commission. It became, in 1998, a standard setter, not just a talk shop for regulators. It became a formal standard setter in the aftermath of the Asian financial crisis. It is going on, I think, now to become something else. But they have, and IOSCO has produced a number of different international financial standards, but this was the first set. And in 1998, what did they look at to come up with principles and objectives of securities regulation? Well, you looked at U.S. regulation, because that's really all there was at that time in terms of a set of formal written regulation that we looked at in the whole securities regulation. So these objectives and principles of securities regulation are what I call very backward-looking. They look back to U.S. regulation in the 1990s, U.S. financial institutions of the 1990s, the market institutions of the 1990s. They tried to update them in 2003, and there was great reluctance. There was a real resistance to updating them, primarily by the World Bank. So they didn't. They just sort of tinkered by putting in some footnotes and then coming up with manuals as to how to use these financial standards. They tried to update them again in 2008, and this is a quote from an IOSCO paper, absolutely identical to 2003. So much for the flexibility of soft law and adaptability and change. They could not change these principles. Finally, in June 2010, they added 8 new principles, including things like systemic risk. But this is soft law, which is not soft. It was very difficult to change the IOSCO principles. They couldn't, they didn't. And there's some interesting reasons, perhaps, why. Why was it so difficult? Why was there this resistance to revisit the substance of these principles when the experiences with the FSAPs, the teams coming back, trying to use the principles in various countries, coming back saying, look, we can't apply these principles in this way in these countries. There are a number of reasons for that. One regulator told me, one Australian regulator working on the 2008 revisions to the principles, said that one of the reasons they didn't want to change the principles themselves was that they had been promulgated, they had been spread in too many different jurisdictions, and it would be awkward to go back to those countries and tell them, well, I think maybe this isn't quite right. Now, what are the hidden assumptions that are in the IOSCO principles? I think the hidden assumptions of U.S. securities regulation flow through into the IOSCO principles. And these are some of the hidden assumptions of U.S. securities law. So U.S. securities regulation, it's 1930s legislation, formal written law. It looks at a retail investor equity culture, mom and pop buying shares in General Motors. This is what it's looking at. These are the issues it is addressing. It doesn't look at debt markets, the bond markets. And derivatives, well, derivatives really weren't there at that point. And derivatives are usually structured as debt instruments. There is in U.S. securities regulation inadequate treatment of what would be called the private market or the unregulated market. This is where the hedge funds operate, because the legislation and the regulation was looking at stock exchanges, public offerings, retail investors buying shares of General Motors. U.S. regulation usually has an intensely domestic focus, And in some, if you look at these particular underlying assumptions of U.S. securities regulation, you can see the hot buttons of the financial crisis. U.S. securities regulation did not deal with these particular issues. In fact, U.S. securities regulation, the regulator in Washington has no jurisdiction over derivatives at all, except for one little exception. So, which were instrumental in the global financial crisis. So you see, the hot buttons of the global financial crisis were not dealt with in U.S. regulation, and U.S. regulation forms the basis for the IOSCO principles. So the fact that U.S. law and ideology drives some of the international financial standards, like the IOSCO principles, is somewhat ironic, because originally the United States would not participate in the FSAP process. It would not volunteer to have its financial system assessed against the international financial standards. My country, that Boy Scout of the international community, was the first to volunteer. Yes, we'll volunteer. Come in and tell us, you know. And Canada got burned. Canada was rated as being rather mediocre. Its financial system was rated against the international financial standards, and it was rather mediocre. Now, Canada is one of the few countries that has really come through the global financial crisis in pretty good shape, so that gives lie to that particular assessment. Now, the official reason why the United States did not volunteer to have the IMF come in and assess its financial system against international financial standards, this was an official reason that was given. But it did not want to overly tax the IMF staff, because it was such a complex financial system, and they didn't think that the IMF staff should be, it would take too much of their energy to come into the United States. Now, on the other hand, in the aftermath of the global financial crisis, the IMF came out at one point and attributed its own inability to foresee the global financial crisis to the refusal of the United States to participate. So this is the IMF and the U.S. Treasury calling it by other names. Okay, now, the U.S. did finally agree to participate in the Financial Sector Assessment Program. This was May 2010. The report came out, and I was joking with someone at the Securities and Exchange Commission in Washington in the course of when the sector assessment was going on in the United States, and I said, well, you know, this is going to be very peculiar to see how the IMF rates U.S. regulation institutions against IOSCO principles, which are based on U.S. regulation of institutions. It's going to be very interesting to see how the ratings come out. This is how they, this is how they came out. This is the response. Governments, when the IMF and the World Bank go in and look at the systems and do their ratings, check boxes, governments have the ability to respond. They write a response to the IMF in terms of what they think of the assessment. None of this has to be made public. None of it has to be made public. If a country does not want the assessment to be made public, it's not made public. However, the United States, transparency, disclosure, it had to be made public. The United States did not like being rated against international financial standards, the IOSCO principles. This is the response to the response of the U.S. Treasury to the IOSCO principles and rating by the IMF. Some U.S. authorities firmly believe that the overall ratings are not reflective of the U.S. system or the regulated marketplace. So they did not like what was found and how they were rated, which is a little bit ironic. Now, the Financial Stability Board is the successor, and is trying to overcome the difficulties that the Financial Stability Forum faced, but the FSAPs are going to continue. And there is the use of international financial standards in the same way. The FSAPs are going to continue, continued focus on compliance to global standards through the process. My own view, and this may change now that the Financial Stability Board has a new head, who's Mark Carney, from the governor of the Bank of Canada. But up to the point that I've seen the Financial Stability Board so far, it has really been working on the margins, and the extent to which it will overcome some of the penalties of its predecessors is still unclear. Now, I'm going to go through this fairly quickly because I know that I'm just about out of time here. But this is the third part that I wanted to bring, the third strand that I wanted to bring here. And it was, as I said, when I was looking at international financial practice and seeing that the soft law discourse about international financial standards, it wasn't there. It's not there. And I started to think about, well, what do international practitioners really think about? Are they interested in international financial standards and their nature as soft law when they're doing their transactions? And they're not. They don't hear about it. They don't talk about it. So what are they thinking about when they're doing large transactions that cross borders? And this is what I think. This is the list of what I think international commercial practitioners are thinking about. They're looking at effectiveness, not enforcement. They're not thinking about judicial enforcement. They are balancing risk in an uncertain world. They are instinctively looking at issues from a multiplicity of perspectives, because you have a multiplicity of participants from different countries, jurisdictions, industries, different financial accountants, you have lawyers. So you have this multiplicity of perspectives that are being brought to bear on a particular transaction. And you also have a multiplicity of mechanisms that are put into place to promote effectiveness. And that you also, I think, have an instinctive recognition of multiple forms of normativity and the use of redundancy. And so, for example, this is an example from international project finance. You have the creation of a virtually autonomous legal framework through contract, tens of thousands of pages of contract. In emerging economies where a lot of project finance takes place, this is building of hydroelectric dams, for example. This is my example of this in this particular paper, a particular hydroelectric project. You have a lot of different participants, and you have multiple choices of law. You're not looking, as I say, you're emerging, especially emerging economies, there is going to be very little written law, and you faint hope of judicial enforcement. No, you're not looking at written law, you're not looking at judicial enforcement. This is an example of a transaction I actually worked on. It was the largest private sector cross-border power project in the world in 2005. It came into operation in March last year. Laos, small, poor country, population, actually Laos 2003, when we were first working on this, the population of Laos, I think, was 3 million people. Now 6.5 million people is indicative of how quickly these populations are growing. GDP per capita, low GDP. A huge amount of financing required to build this huge hydroelectric project. These were the various participants. Even international commercial arbitration was not foreseen as being a dispute resolution mechanism. It was there in the documents, but no one expected to ever get even international commercial arbitration. What had been put in place was an internal panel of experts to resolve disputes as it went along. A predetermined internal panel of experts. Lao law was applicable. Lao law. Where no Lao law, English law would be applicable. And it was extremely unclear where Lao law stopped and English law would begin. This is the kind of uncertainty that the commercial practitioners deal with. But they never expected to have recourse to Lao law or English law. This was part of the balancing of the balancing of risks. But this was one of the most interesting things about this whole transaction was, and this is part of what I'm talking about, the multiplicity of redundancy, the multiplicity, the use of redundancy, multiplicity of mechanisms. The whole stack of contractual documents, which would have been about this high, was taken to the National Assembly and enacted into law. Legislation, formal written legislation. It was symbolic, and it was very easily done in a one-party state. So that my point here is that there's redundancy of the mechanisms. The entire endeavor was fraught with uncertainty, and so, but it was a process of calculated risk-taking with redundancy, because multiple forms of normativity supported by commercial expectations. And this is where I started to think about the Lex Mercatoria, because you have international commercial practice being cognizant of this dynamism and layered complexity of systems and the granularity that you don't find in the soft law discourse. You have this chasm between the gritty world of international finance and action and the lofty realm of international financial standards. So with the international financial standards, you get this top-down, assumption-ridden international financial standards being very problematic. But I don't think it's necessarily due to their soft non-nature. I think it's due to their substance, and that they may be looking at the wrong place for their substance. They're looking at national law. And really, this is where they should be looking. They should be looking at commercial practice, international commercial practice in terms of resolving these financial standards. And this is what started me to think about the Lex Mercatoria. Is there a Lex Mercatoria of international finance which is operating under the surface of formal nation-state legislation, and definitely under the surface of international financial standards? And I started to look around and for some examples of this. Now, Lex Mercatoria, I've been using the term Lex Mercatoria, and I'll just give you three, not exactly definitions, but understandings of the term that come from an article by Ralph Michaels a few years ago, just to give you an idea of what I'm talking about. Because again, I think with this particular term, there are different understandings of it, and it's a very, very slippery term itself. But there is one understanding of it, which is the first stage being this ancient Lex Mercatoria of the Middle Ages, which is sometimes now being contested as a myth, but a transnational set of norms and procedural principles established by and for commerce in the relative autonomy from states. Then a second understanding, or a second stage, the new Lex Mercatoria, this is the 20th century, an informal and flexible net of rules and arbitrators establishing a private international commercial law. And then a third stage, the new Lex Mercatoria, which moves to a system of law with codified legal rules, unity law principles of international commercial law, and strongly institutionalized court-like international arbitration. Now, all of this is controversial. All of these formulations of what is Lex Mercatoria is controversial, and they are controversial. But what I see in international finance is I do see international financial markets being supported by a large body of their own Lex Mercatoria, in the sense of the old Lex Mercatoria, this transnational set of norms and procedural principles established by and for commerce and relative autonomy from states. And in fact, there may be separate sets of transnational commercial law for specialized areas of international business. I mean, I've heard Lex Petrolia. There's a Lex Petrolia for the oil and gas industry, but there's a Lex Sportiva for sports law, international sports law. So maybe there's a Lex Financiera or Lex Derivativas. But what I see is a set of norms and procedural principles that demonstrates a continuity and persistence over a long period of time in finance. And I'm going to give you an example here, and this is where I'll end the talk. Oral contracts, non-written contracts, were recognized among merchants. In England, there is an exception to the statute of frauds in the City of London. Now, the City of London is a geographically defined marketplace. It's a place within the larger metropolitan area of London. And within the City of London, the geographically defined marketplace, the statute of frauds does not apply. Now, what is the statute of frauds? Well, contracts which are where performance is contemplated to extend over more than 1 year have to be in writing in order to be judicially enforceable. Now, there is an exception to that within the City of London, which means you can have oral contracts, which are long-term contracts. And you see as an example of this, the motto of the London Stock Exchange, 1801, my word is my bond. So an oral contract is the motto. The enforceability of an oral contract is the motto of the London Stock Exchange. Now, the London Stock Exchange is the premier international capital market of the world, and the City of London is the home to the swaps and derivatives markets, which were much maligned during the global financial crisis. Now, the interesting thing is that the swaps and derivatives were developed, modern version of swaps and derivatives, which became increasingly complex over time, developed in the 1980s as a telephone market. This was before the internet. You had telexes, you had faxes, but you didn't have internet. And so this developed as a telephone market in London among small group of traders doing their deals by telephone. These were oral contracts for huge amounts of money for long periods of time, 10 years, 15 years, maybe even 20 years in these swaps. And so these long-term contracts, oral contracts concluded on telephone, were considered to be enforceable. Later, there were standardized industry contracts that were developed to support the oral contracts, the telephone contracts. But what I found the most interesting was that when I went back to London last year, 2011, now the age of the internet, texting, that the swaps and derivative market is still a telephone market. People told me they still do the transactions on the telephone. It may be later that they, in theory, always later, but not necessarily, that you have written standardized contracts that are put together, but the deals are concluded on the telephone. And that made me think of an incident that occurred to me personally last summer. I was at my house in Canada over the summer, and I got an email from a broker in Montreal, and I have a little bit of pension money there. This is a man I have not seen in 20 years. I haven't seen this man. I met him maybe once. And every now and then I get an email from him and he says, "You've got $5,000 that has to be reinvested." And I say, "Yes, I know." And he said, "I have to talk to you." And I say, "Why can't we do this by email?" And he said, "No, it's against the industry rules. The Investment Industry Regulatory Authority of Canada and my own internal domestic rules require that I physically talk to you on the telephone to get your instructions." And so he calls me on it finally. I said, "Well, I'm a moving target. I'm all over the world. I'm a moving target. Getting me on the telephone is a real trick." And so we finally get together on the telephone, and we sort of joke about this archaic rule that he has to call me on the telephone to get me to say yes, put $5,000 into a Canadian government bond. And then he said, "But it seems like an archaic rule." He said, "But it's been a long time since I've talked to you, but I recognize your voice." And I said, "George, I recognize your voice too." And this is someone I had not talked to in 10 years. So I think that there may be something very interesting going on with oral contracts. And that you have this persistence of oral contracts in the industry, investment industry, regulatory authority rules of Canada. Those trades have to be confirmed not in writing, which they could be easily, but oral contracts. Okay, I am going to end right there because I've gone grossly over my time. But my point is persistence. But here are the implications of this. That, I don't have answers here. But should international financial standards setters be exploring this lex migratoria of finance rather than national law? Are international standards attempting to create a new lex migratoria? Do we need international financial standards or just better lex migratoria? Was the GFC, the global financial crisis, triggered in part by a breakdown in the operation of this lex migratoria of international finance? Will the waves of re-regulation, Dodd-Frank in the United States, the legislative reaction to the global financial crisis in the United States, I went to print it out when it was passed 18 months ago or so, immediately stopped because it was going to be 2,200 pages to print out. And so, or on the contrary, will the regulatory disarray, and I think that right now there is regulatory disarray, give rise to new opportunistic forms of lex migratoria? So I've gone on, 15 minutes?
Well, first of all, thank you for this very interesting seminar. That was very thought-provoking, and the paper as well was very much interesting. I just wanted to go back to the first part of your presentation about, and deal a little bit more about comparative law and what you said before on the difference in the way soft law is perceived in the different systems. So, how do you think that the influence of the European Union might influence the way in which soft law is perceived in the different systems that we have in Europe, so at least continental Europe and the UK? And there's another point that I just wanted to mention. So before, you said that basically the continental Europe somehow is more favorable to the idea of financial standards, maybe also because they're written. So since I'm Italian, so I say we. So we're somehow used to having this written law, written normativity. So in a way, it is something that we can perceive as known and fair. But how would you put this together with the discourse about the shift from democracy to technocracy? Because this is something that somehow is strictly related. So I have the feeling that maybe financial standards can be perceived in a more positive way, also because, in a sense, democracy and the democratic procedures have failed to address very technical problems, and these problems have come to be targeted by the technocrats. So that's, in a way, the whole thing about Europe is about this. So how would you relate these things, if I may ask?
Oh, well, I'm going to do something that you do in the U.S. law schools. Is I'm going to ask you what you think.
Oh.
I know it's a dirty trick, but no, truly. I mean, some of these ideas I'm floating them as ideas, and they're based on anecdotes. They're based on understanding. They're based on just observations as I go through the world, and I do a lot of going through the world. So I am interested in what you think.
Well, so as far as my understanding is concerned, I do believe that, so starting from the first part of my question, so the way in which Europe and the European Union has influenced the way we perceive Europe, so this might have been like an element in, for example, the way in which the United Kingdom has somehow changed a little bit its perception of law. It's in any case a very small change, but still there has been somehow a tendency towards an harmonization, but in the end this harmonization cannot really happen. That's at least my perception. I mean, I do believe that harmonization is something extremely tricky, because in which sense are you going to harmonize? Who's going to lose its peculiarity? Who's going to lose its tradition, its history? So we should always be extremely careful about using this kind of terminology. On the other hand, we definitely need harmonized standards in a sense, as we have a globalized economy, globalized financial transactions. So we definitely need a set of common rules, a set of common standards. But I have absolutely no idea on how to set the standards, in the sense that the risk is always that the strongest power will prevail and will impose its standards. And on the other hand, what you very clearly explained is the failure of the previous attempts of having all the important actors dealing together with the setting of standards and accepting external powers. So on the one hand, we have a very big reluctancy on the side of the states to give away more of their power in favor of external authorities, international authorities, because the states are losing that much of sovereignty. On the other hand, though, and it's not on the other hand, it's moreover. So moreover, this is completely related to the fact that even on the national sphere, we have an increasing number of authorities, of entities that deal with technical things and with regulations. So my perception is that this is the direction, but I am not sure whether this is desirable in a sense. And I'm afraid that this might somehow affect the democratic processes as well. So it's a little bit confusing. I never expressed it loudly, I would say.
I have one comment, but I'd be interested in hearing other comments and questions. As I say, there are really four parts to the presentation of the paper that I've tried to link together, so there may be questions on other parts. But one of the criticisms of international financial standards has been a democracy criticism. And one of the criticisms, for example, of I'm trying to see if I can bring it up, of the Financial Stability Forum between 1999 and 2009, when it was thrown into the dustbin, was that it was not transparent and it was not democratic, and that it was, this is a quote from the Financial Times, it was obscure to the point of being invisible. It was never clear what action would follow or indeed who would act. A lack of transparency and contestability, this sort of exclusive, reclusive club where there wasn't any democratic process at all, or debate, or contestation of the principles that were being chosen and the way in which they were being implemented. So I think that international financial standards, there is a problem of democracy and legitimacy with the international financial standards, particularly as they were being developed and, well, not developed, because the FSS, the Financial Stability Forum, was not a standard setter. It was a standard promoter. It was not a standard setter, but it was promoting international financial standards, which I saw in my own experience as being in a very indiscriminate way and in a very, very clumsy way. Some of the international financial standards were very highly developed, and we could critique them, they have been critiqued, but a lot of people who've been working on, knowledgeable people who've been working on them for a long time, and other standards, as my Italian financial economist co-author called them, were hot air. No, fried air. Fried air. Is that a literal translation from the Italian? Yeah, fried air. He said this is fried air. Yeah. But they were being promoted as having equal legitimacy and authority and something to be emulated by all sorts of emerging economies, where it was really a lot of fried air. Yeah.
I have two remarks on the two questions that you just raised. So one would be the comparative dimension, the other the legitimacy dimension. In the comparative dimension, I very much appreciated your distinction between the American and the English. I had some more doubts on the European dimension, as our colleague had, and my doubts go in the direction. What you said, I think, would quite well fit for the French political and economic structure. Code, state. But we would have problems in the Netherlands, Denmark, Scandinavia, Germany, Switzerland, Austria, because there you have an old tradition of, shall we call, self-regulation, even stemming from the old medieval guilds that then have been translated into association-led economies, still market economies, but they're industry associations, employer associations, the labor unions. The professionals they could play a very dominant role in a kind of self-regulation which is not so far away from the voluntary codes. So the introduction of the voluntary codes, in a sense, was responded by, reinforced by this old tradition, and I think this is the reason why Hock told you, they work quite well. The second, the legitimacy issue, I mean, I like your critique of the top-down strategy of financial regulation and standards. I'm not so sure about your hopes about the Lex Mercatoria. I mean, of course you're right, they're close to practice, they're effective, and they are the real law in the sense one could, so this is the soft law which is almost the hard law. But the problem is, it's strong as a law of coordination, contract law, also your example, but it's rather weak as a law of regulation, public interest coming in, or let's call it, how can Lex Mercatoria deal with the externality, for example, ecological externalities? And also the financial crisis had this kind of external problems, right? So I think then the question is, if we have these complementary deficits of both types of soft law, from above and from below, are there ways out, are there perspectives? And this would be the alternative to put. One would be moving the top-down approach closer to the practices of the Lex Mercatoria. By what? By bringing experts in, by giving social sciences a larger say, maybe more practical. And the other would be more effective. And the other way would be something we could call the politicization of the Lex Mercatoria. So how do you bring this kind of third-party and public interest into this effective law? So do you have an opinion? But don't turn the tables around now, right?
Sorry. I was just pulling up this slide while you were talking, because I thought that it was very interesting what you were saying about the public interest, and if you're going to rely on the contract, then how do you bring in the public interest? And this is the transaction that I was using as it's a real transaction, a real large transaction. They have a big hydroelectric dam in Laos now. But look at some of the, I got them here. Look at some of the players. Now, these, you've got EDF is Électricité de France. They were the general managers, contractors. And you have all these suppliers, subcontractors, private bankers, there were investment bankers involved. But then you've got the government of Laos. That's why you had Laotian law. It had to be the formal choice of law. But of course, there wasn't a lot of Laotian law. And then you've got the World Bank. And it was actually, and then you've got the Multilateral Investment Guarantee Authority, which is agency, which is a part of the World Bank group, which provides guarantees for a fee, guarantees to various kinds of infrastructure projects. But you've got, what you've got here is you've got a couple, what you have here in this particular transaction is that you have the interaction of private, very, very dynamic interaction of private sector and public sector. So you have the government of Laos saying, we're going to take this pile of contracts to the National Assembly and we're going to enact them into formal law, the choice of Laotian law. And then you have the World Bank. Well, what was the World Bank? International Financial Institution, Development Agency doing? What they were doing, they were bringing in the ecological and resettlement issues. There was what they were looking at in particular was that before the World Bank would be involved in the financing, and the World Bank would have a very small portion of actually financing, what the World Bank was really doing for the project was giving the project an imprimatur of meeting certain standards of ecological and primarily ecological considerations, so that there were a large number of huge studies that were done on the social impact of the dam project. These dam projects are very controversial and create huge devastation ecologically and socially for the people who are resettled and lose their livelihoods, and they're extraordinarily difficult. So whether or not what the World Bank does in those circumstances is controversial, whether it is effective, but to the extent that there is a public interest in resettlement issues, treatment of ethnic minorities, the social implications, the ecological implications, there is certainly a public interest which is being looked at through the lens of the World Bank involvement. The World Bank does not provide its limited financing unless the project, all of the studies are done and the assessments are done and certain criteria are met. So I think it doesn't always happen like that. But in this particular example, I think you have that interaction. Oh, yes, please.
I have a question going back to what you said around soft law, as international financial standards as soft law. Do you personally give hopes to soft law as opposite to the hard law and regulations? And as you said that those soft law and FSF and FSFE programs didn't totally predict or let it the crisis. But at some points they had these alerting results, like regarding Iceland and other cases. So do you think we can still, what can we do if we still put hopes on soft law? Like, should we invent and try to develop new standards, or narrowing down those set of principles that were already developed, and concentrating more on effectiveness of the implementation? What do you think?
Well, I think in terms of the financial sector assessment programs, there's certainly enormous learning that has gone on in 10 years. So, and there is this, as I say, this internal process of self-criticism at the World Bank and the IMF. Now, these are both very difficult institutions. You know, the IMF and the World Bank, very complex, difficult institutions internally. But it was one friend of mine said that the World Bank said that half of what they do is garbage and the other half is actually quite good. And you have to take both because that's the nature of the institutions. But the optimistic part of me does hope that there is learning by experience. I see more learning by experience at the OECD, actually. The OECD doesn't have the same kind of political role and constraints as the IMF and the World Bank, and I think that what the work that the OECD does with respect to international standards is actually more responsive to reality and more useful. I think what the OECD has done over time with both the principles of corporate governance, by learning from the experience with the use of those principles, as well as developing, for example, the principles of corporate governance for state-owned enterprises. You know, I remember being on these FSACs going around the world, and you try to take the old version of the OECD principles of corporate governance and you go into a country like China where the majority of corporations are controlled by the state, and how do you apply these principles developed in New York City and London? You know, I mean, it's, but the OECD learned from that. The OECD said, oh, wait a minute, you know, we're missing something here. And the interesting thing is how ideology plays through the development of these standards, because I remember talking to some of the people working on the development of the OECD principles of corporate governance for state-owned enterprises, and they told me, I forget which year they appeared, I think they were 2006, but within recent memory. But some of the people at the OECD working on those principles, I remember them telling me at the time, just before they published them, that the United States had refused to participate in the principles, in developing those principles, because they were ideologically opposed to the concept of state-owned enterprises. So you see how politics and ideology really does play through principles and the development of these standards and principles. Now, you had a different question, and you'd have to remind me what your second question was. If I haven't answered it yet. Maybe I have.
Yeah, I think, yeah.
So I do have some hope. I do have some hope, yeah.
Thank you very much again for your interest in this talk.